Ready? Different. Right, hello, good afternoon, everyone, to this meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee. Could I, as usual, welcome both Grant Patterson and Scarlett Mayer along to our meeting, who are representatives from Grant Thornton UK LLP and are our external auditors. Going through the agenda, part one, the public business. One is the evacuation procedure. It is, as you see written down there, everyone go through the one door there and down the stairs, not in the lift please, unless you need help to do so, and out the front door. The other point is, please make sure that all of your mobile phones are set to silent, and guess whose isn't? I know. And I do advise you that the recording has been turned on, and we will be recorded, as I thought. Right, item 2 there is apologies for absence. I have been notified of apologies from councillors Gizane and Neil Phillips. Thank you. Minutes of the previous meeting, of which a copy is enclosed in your papers. Do we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of November? Is that agreed? Agreed. Simon's a true record. Yeah, I'll do it in a second. Item 4, declarations of interest. There is an explanation about declarations of interest there, but you do have a list enclosed within your papers about what they are. Does anyone have any further declarations of interest that they might wish to declare? No? Okay, thank you. Agenda item 5, public consultation. Members of the public are given the opportunity to speak on specific agenda items if notice has been received. Have we received any members of the public who wish to speak?
Councillor Darker would like to speak on items 6, 7, 10 and 11.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further members of the public wish to speak, or they haven't had notification? Item 6, which was a special item that you were sent relating to the external audit plan. I will move over to Grant or Scarlett if you want.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to hand over to Scarlett, who's going to take you through the external audit plan for this year.
Okay. If I take you straight to page 5, this is the key part of the document that highlights the significant risks that we've identified. The first one is the revenue cycle includes fraudulent transactions. That is a standard risk that we have to consider under ISO 240, but we've actually rebutted that presumed risk based on the nature of the revenue streams at the council and the fact that we think there's an incentive or opportunity to commit fraud. The second one that we've got is the management override of controls. Again, this is a presumed risk under ISO 240, which is non-rebuttable. For this, we will consider estimates made by management and judgments. We'll also look at journal entries and changes in accounting policies and any significant unusual transactions that we identify. The next risk that we've identified that we consider to be significant is the valuation of property, plant and equipment, and in particular in relation to the valuation of land and buildings, revaluations during the year and any possible impairments.
Well, on that one, Chair, just for the committees, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that, that's similar to you, we are subject to our own regulation as well, and our regulator, not so much on National Grant forms, but on all firms, is asking them to take in terms of reporting back to audit committees, to look at the way they report back on areas of complex judgment and evaluation of PPE, is that therefore they are sort of challenging audit firms that way. That should be a significant risk. So I don't think there'll be a significant change to our audit approach to those figures in the accounts this year, but we're highlighting that they are subject to a complex valuation, and you have a valuer who does that for you. So therefore we're reporting back to you on those in more detail this year. But that's really just, I wouldn't say that the risk has inherently increased at the council per se.
Thank you.
And then on a similar basis, we've got the valuation of the pension fund net liability, which is first of all due to the size of the balance and also because it's a significant estimate. So we'll review the control in place by management to ensure the liability isn't misstated. We'll review the actuary report and the assumptions that they've made, see if we think they're reasonable. And over the page, on page 7, we've got our reasonably possible risks. So these are the risks that we don't think are significant. There's perhaps a little less judgment in these risks, but we still think that we need to pay particular attention to them. So the first one is employee remuneration, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's such a large percentage of your overall expenditure. And so we want to make sure that it's complete and that there's no transactions that are being excluded from that balance. Then for operating expenses on a similar basis, we need to make sure that it's complete, it's a significant balance in the accounts, and also contains a lot of estimates, like year-end accruals, so we will review the year-end accruals as part of that testing. Other work we'll look at, other than just looking at the primary statements themselves, we'll also make sure that the disclosures in the annual governance statement are in line with the guidance issued and also our understanding of the council. Similarly, for the narrative statement, we need to make sure that that's in line with what's disclosed in the financial statements and also our understanding of the client.
And there have been some minor changes to that this year. I'm sure you'll be taken through in terms of the narrative statement. There's a requirement under the regulations, as always has been, to look at, in terms of the narrative statement, and to look at how you use your resources. SIPFA's done some changes to the content of the narrative statement this year, where it's asking you to consider certain areas around your sort of your business models and your use of resources and elements like that. So there won't necessarily be new headings in there, but you might just see a subtle change in the word. It's for Simona and her team to make, but there have been some subtle changes to the way that the narrative report you'll see it this year. I think it's trying to get it more to councils explaining their performance in the year and into their strategic objectives. And to make, I suppose in a way, make it easier and more accessible for users of the accounts to understand how well you perform this year.
We'll also look at the going concern and ask for management to provide their view on the going concern assumption. It's not that we think there's a particular risk in relation to going concern, but it is something that we have to review. We've set our planning materiality at 2% of the forecast gross expenditure. This is similar to last year, and that gives us materiality of 1.6 million. We also have a lower level that we set for misstatements that we want to report to those charged with governance, and that's our triviality. And the clearly trivial level is 82,000 for this year. So anything that we find that's above that, we'll report back to you within our audit findings report. Also, for materiality, we are setting a lower level for senior officers' remuneration. This is because we think there's a lot of public interest in these disclosures and they're quite sensitive. So what we've suggested for the moment is that we'll have a materiality level of 50,000, but that is subject to review as we go along, and we might decide to change that when we receive the financial statements. We also have to give a value for money opinion, as we have in previous years. And we've done our initial risk assessment and we identified future savings plans as a potential risk to look into. we'll just be looking at the saving plans in place and having discussions with management around that, reviewing the plans, and conclude whether we think that there's an issue there and whether we think the risk has been mitigated appropriately. In terms of logistics, the team and audit fees, the team will be consistent with last year, so there'll be myself and Grant and also William Guest, who will be on site doing most of the field work. And he'll also be supported by our trainees. The planning has already taken place. We started that just before Christmas. We're due to be on site towards the end of this month for the first interim visit. We've actually got 2 interim visits this year because with the early deadline being the 31st of July, that puts more pressure on the year end. So we want to bring as much as we can forward to the interim visits. So we've got one in the week commencing 29th of January, and then we've got another one in March. We'll then bring the findings from that interim work to you at the March Audit Committee, and then we'll return on the 18th of June for the year-end audit, with the findings to be reported to you in July, so that we can sign our opinion and that you can sign your accounts before the end of July. The audit fees are also noted on page 12, which are in line with the fee that we charged last year, and it's a scale fee set by PSAA. We've got some details on page 13 at the early close. There is going to be more pressure on the finance team this year and on ourselves to meet that deadline, and this just sets out our expectations from management and what we will give it in return to make sure that we do meet that deadline. We'll also do certification of housing capital receipts grant, and that's noted on page 14 that this doesn't impact our independence due to the size of the fee and the nature of the work. There are no independence issues in relation to that. And then on page 16 we've got permit A, which is revised ISAs. I think Grant's kind of started to touch on this. There are a couple of changes to the way that our opinion is structured this year. We'll need to comment on the director's use of the going concern basis at preparation of the accounts, and also we'll need to note any material uncertainties identified in relation to going concern in our opinion, if there are any. We don't anticipate there will be, but that's just something that we need to consider.
Yes, so if you do want to read the detail of our audit report, as opposed to the final line, there'll be a slight change in the middle of it. Whereas before on the going concern, if you had issues as an auditor, you might have had something called an emphasis of matter. We never had one here. We now have to give a positive opinion in terms of what you have done as management to assess that. And as Scarlett was saying, with our material uncertainties, so we report by exception now. So you'll see a slight change in the wording. And everything is where the conclusion will be at the front. I think is the other way around is what you will see. So rather than you have to go through the opinion and then find out what our final conclusion is, you put that at the front and then just take people through it. So there'll be some changes to what the wording you'll see, but the basis of the opinion is essentially the same. That we'll be looking at the financial statements and the value for money conclusion. But so when you read it, you might just see some slight changes in the structure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Conduct, I understand you have questions that you wish to ask.
Thank you, Chair. There's actually a few sort of general comments I wish to raise at this point in the audit cycle. Every year we have this discussion as to whether how good the council is managed determined by how good it's audited. And the audit is actually there to show what we've done has been properly recorded, not necessarily what we've done has been sensible. So if you take the car parking changes and the depot moves, I believe they've been successfully audited, i.e. the cost of them and the income's been all successfully recorded, but that doesn't mean that they're actually successful projects or successful changes of charges, because clearly they weren't. The depot fit out cost
What's
three.
that to do with the audit?
Councillor Haynes, please, carry on.
I'll come back to it. Yeah, I'll just listen.
Yeah,
and then
I'll
come
ask
back.
you
Yeah,
to come
yeah,
back
yeah.
and just carry on, please.
Yeah, so a clear point we need to separate is the fact that we've actually audited the transactions as being correct, and whether or not our project plans spent the amount of money they were supposed to spend. And a key weakness I would like this year's audit to look at is to actually see, do things cost what they're supposed to do? Because when we do a budget, we say we've got £600,000 to fit out the depot, it ends up costing £2 million. We say we'll raise car parking charges, it will create another £2,000 of income, that doesn't happen. So there's a whole load of issues around the over-optimistic planning we have. Second thing is, we have things like NABSEL that are buying lots of property, or the council's buying property and then leasing them through NABSEL on. And at council meetings, we've repeatedly been told the value of property does not go down by members of the Conservative group and members of the Labour group. There is clearly a risk for anyone as old as me, who's been through the property cycle several times, of values going up and down. And so I would clearly like it identifying what the risks we're taking by actually, it may be a good idea to do it, but we just seem to be not acknowledging that there are risks associated with owning more property, particularly as the property market may go down very considerably in Nuneaton and Bedworth, depending on how the economy performs over the next 2 or 3 years. And we need to know, if we have taken on, say, £10 million worth of property, that could lose £2 million, or it could gain £2 million. But it's these sort of risks that need to be identified and made blatantly clear. And the final 2 points, pension liabilities. We had a massive mess with this sports contract with 2 over. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again if we, in the changes, change any and outsource more stuff. And finally, materiality. We should be considering materiality on the general fund, because we're not an £82 million organisation, we're a £14 million organisation and a £50 million organisation for housing. So we should be looking at materiality about the level of 2% of the general fund, because actually that's what we have general control over. And a £100,000 or £200,000 problem on the general fund is a big problem. Thank you, Chair.
I'll respond to some of those specifically and some of the more generic approach. In terms of what the accounts record, yes, they should be, and they are a historic record of the transactions that the authority has conducted in the year. So I agree with Councillor Condacor that our audit view is, do they give a true and fair view of the income expenditure of the accounts in the year? So that's primarily the financial statements opinion. The areas he touched upon specifically, I won't comment directly upon them. They would, to some elements, be brought within our consideration of the value for money conclusion. And what we would look is, we do a generic look at, in terms of performance indicators around what you set yourselves as a council, in terms of what you see yourselves, your strategic objectives. It's not my role in order to comment directly upon policy. You are elected members. That is your role and your responsibility. What we look at from an auditing perspective is, have you acted within the statutory framework that has been set by you? And ultimately, I suppose, if the challenge comes in, have you acted reasonably and lawfully is the ultimate one. So we're not making that judgment. We do have that requirement around value for money conclusion. We've taken on board the guides from the NAO. We would look at some of those broader performance indicators when forming our final view. In a way, that's why we focused to a certain extent on your medium-term financial plan this year as being what we consider to be the residual significant risk. And I think some of those issues that were raised there would factor into the work we would do around that, in terms of are the savings that you expected from the various, I suppose, the depot move being generated, and we would look at that. And I've already begun to have discussions with the finance team around that, and we would look at that as part of the overall consideration. In terms of the more, I suppose, specific areas I mentioned around value, we don't audit, we are not the auditors of NABSEL per se, it is a company, so that we won't audit that. What we do, and actually at this point in time it is not of such a size that as an authority you require it's material enough to require group consolidation, so it will be a disclosure note within the financial statements. We will look at the audited financial statements and any assumptions to make sure that the note is fairly presented. You have broad powers as a council to enter into commercial transactions. Yes, you need to exercise those appropriately and prudently, and CITFA does actually republished its treasury management, its code of treasury management and its prudential guidelines. There will be a requirement for you as an authority, whilst it kicks in 18-19, to produce something called a capital funding strategy. And that will be, and in a way I think that is trying to tie up those where you are investing your money and where you're looking to, and making sure that you are not, I suppose, overstretching yourself. It's trying to draw those codes together. That really, whilst it kicks in 18-19, I think there's a realisation that at probably the first time you'll be able to fully publish it, because you have to set your budget now and the guidance only just come in. It's probably, I think, more towards the beginning of 1920. And that'll be the same for all councils. So I think in a way that is trying to draw that together around making sure that all councils, not just yourselves, are acting prudently. And certainly I think the government has had or DCLG has expressed its view recently around certain transactions not this council into that others. It's not for me to judge upon that. I think as long as you are acting prudentially and acting reasonably, that's my role as auditor, that's why we get involved. So we will take, I think, a lot of that on board. But in terms of general specifically, yes, our opinion covers the figures in the accounts, they're historic. It's not my role to comment directly on policy, as I say, you're elected members, and that is that is your role in that sense. What our role only comes in is whether, if we feel that actually you have acted maybe outside of your powers, and I don't think at this point in time to consider that. So that'd be my response.
Any other member wish to comment? Councillor Trelawney.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, could I ask Grant just to read out the little bit about materiality again? Sorry, Scarlett, but you were very quiet and I very much started recording, picked that up.
Okay, and picking up, I didn't answer that specifically. So in terms of materiality, I suppose the challenge back was, in terms of your benchmark, we've taken the gross expenditure. Within that, yes, we have taken both the housing and the general fund into consideration, because we believe...
So the figures are, if you can just...
2% of your...
Which is what, 1.4?
1.6 million of your... So if you look at your accounts, it's 2% of... I have to actually fix that now. And it's about 80 million, isn't it, something like that, because of the expenditure on housing and the general fund. And if you break that down, whilst we do that, I mean, 20 odd million of that will be housing benefits, gross expenditure. So then you'll have your gross expenditure on the general fund, which will go into depreciation and things like that. So when you break it down, and then you've got the housing figure comes in terms of...
Grant, I think the point I'm getting to, and that the speaker was alluding to as well, and that a lot of concerns the public would have is, you know, for you to start considering things as being material at 1.6 million for a local authority that, you know, for anybody, 1.6 million is a whole bunch of money. For a local authority that really only has a budget properly of 14 million or 15, whatever, it does look like you'd have to find something truly colossal to be reporting it as an exception.
Well, and we would report, as Scarlett said, anything over our trip. If we found a misstatement,
but even that was 80-odd thousand.
It's 80,000. It's 86.
And is that in aggregate or is that an individual item? Because you could find a whole bunch of things for, you know, £20,000, which add up to be 100, but you wouldn't report them because they weren't.
We would record those, and I think we would then take a judgment call on if they are all of a similar nature. Then we would aggregate them up.
The final thing I wanted to ask you is, what would be the mechanism for the council wanting you to set materiality at a much lower level?
Well, it's our judgment, so it's my call. I mean, I can take on board the challenge, which is do you think it is an appropriate benchmark? I think where we're trying to get the balance right, though, is between, as I say, it's a true and fair view. Lower materiality would, I mean, we've based upon, I suppose, our audit work and our audit fee, to a certain extent, is based upon that level of materiality driving a certain testing strategy. The lower the materiality, the more testing we have to do.
So perhaps the compromise there is that you agree to do a deep dive in one very narrow area and just see if that does find anything out.
I think
if it does, then maybe the council needs to look to pay you to do a more.
Well, I think we need to be careful because, you know, I'm independent of the council. We form our own views on what is material, and we think that that's using the gross expenditure benchmark, which is a consistent one across the sector, is the most appropriate benchmark. I do have the ability to flex it. in a way, what we do, I suppose, in the way I'm picking up your point, if you feel that public scrutiny is higher and justifies a lower materiality, we've considered that. Whilst we recognise 1.6 million, I think I've audited Birmingham before, and it gets to a really big number when you audit Birmingham at one point. I do take on board that, but I think at the moment, I think I've got to balance between the true and fair view and the public and the cost of the audit. We haven't found any issues in our audits in recent years that would suggest to me that there is an inherent problem within the accounts. We would actually, as part of our work this year, look at specific transactions. I didn't want to go into that, but clearly the depot transaction, we would look at that as part of our PPE because there will be a change in that, you know, in terms of the actual transaction event. We would look at those. I haven't gone to the level of the individual testing, but I would be expecting our work to pick that up. And also, if you're then reclassifying, I suppose, your property and elements like that, if anything moves into an asset for sale category, we would again look at that and look at the authority's rationale for moving it. And we also do look at the valuations in year and things and elements like that. So I think you also need to look at, whilst you only set you say it's a £40 million budget, but in terms of the aggregate, what you're controlling and you're responsible for, it is the whole of that amount. It is including the housing revenue account. You as an authority are responsible, whilst there are specific regulations about the ring fencing effectively, you are managing the whole of that amount of money. And therefore, I still would remain that is the appropriate benchmark. I will take on board the challenge in terms of 1.6 million, and I think, yes, for citizens and for council taxpayers, I'm sure if you ask, people would want that amount of money in their bank account if they could have that. But it's not how that's not really when it's true and fair. So in a way, would a reader of your accounts be misled in terms of, I mean, it's driven a lot by the standards and the commercial decisions. That's what you're looking at in the accounts, is if someone had to make a decision based upon the accounts, would they be misled? And that's where the materiality comes in. And it is driven, I think, in those standards driven from the commercial perspective. If someone to either invest in you or to, I suppose, the way purchase you, that they can't do that, is how would they do that? So would they be misled by your financial statements?
Okay, well, I think it's helpful for everyone to understand that that's the acid test.
Yeah.
Because the man on the Bedworth omnibus might think 1.6 million. Anything below that being ignored is not right. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, we're not ignoring it.
Thank you, Chair.
But we're not, at the same time, I think we need to balance it.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, Grant's really because of one of the points we're going to make, just that the 2% materiality level is not just applied to this council, that just is the national guidance that the auditors use, so it's not just something local to us. The other point I was going to make is that there is also a triviality level as well of 82k, so that's substantially lower, and any misstatements or errors above that would still be reported to the auditor.
Yes, a slight change in that we would give it, if you can cast your minds back for those who were on the committee last year in terms of the audit findings report, there's a page in there where we list out adjusted misstatements or something like that, because it's very rare you don't adjust them, to be honest. So you would get that list. And also what we would tend to do as well is, as part of our ongoing audit, we would share with Simone and her team, even if those below the triviality, we would be happy to say, look, we found this, but we wouldn't necessarily sort of bring it to your attention per se, as in your role as those charged with governance. So we do talk to management.
Any further comments? Okay, so therefore can we note the report that has come in from our external auditors with our thanks to them for doing the job for us. Is that agreed?
Move that.
Okay, moving on to agenda item 7, which is relating to the update of the anti-fraud, corruption and bribery strategy. How this report has been done is that, as it says there, any new text is underlined in the main body and any deleted text is already shown. Linda, did you want to present this?
Yeah, thank you. As Chair's just said, the purpose of this report is to update the Council's anti-fraud, corruption and bribery policy, which was last updated in 2012. We have tracked the changes within the document, so all deletions, additions have been highlighted for you. And also in paragraph 4.1, I've bullet pointed what the key changes are. And also I've said in 4.2 that we have got some corporate governance training arranged for our employees in February. We've got 4 sessions arranged and there's almost 100 employees that are attending those sessions. So we will use these to raise awareness of the changes in this policy. But apart from that, I don't think there's anything else I'd like to say, but if there's any questions anyone has.
Councillor Conacle, you wish to speak on this item?
Thank you, Chair. It is far too common, and I know you bring it up on Facebook as well, for people to talk about corruption and bribery, etc. And I don't know of any corruption or bribery at this council. But what I do know is there are cultural things that I worry about. In section 4, which talks about the culture, it talks about openness and honesty. And whilst I don't know of any bribery, etc. in this council, I don't think this council does have a culture of openness and honesty. And in a lot of the events that have happened over my 5 years at this council, it seems to have a culture of cover things up and dishonesty. Now, there is a big problem here, and I do think we need a cultural change at this council to actually put our hands up when we do make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I make loads of mistakes. But we do have a cultural problem in that the council is never wrong, as far as some people are concerned, and those that can say things that cast doubt on the council's correctness quite often get held before standards for bringing the council into disrepute. I do think we have cultural problems, and so I just wanted to raise that point in case anyone thinks, A, this council is corrupt, but I don't think it is, but I do not think this council is as open and as transparent as it should be. Thank you, Chair.
There is, of course, Councillor Condé, if you wish to take up the opportunity to make a complaint about anything that you see is not correct within this council. Are there any other members that wish to comment? Councillor Coughlin.
It was a question. Sorry.
Yes, if you wish to ask a question.
Okay, well, I'll be gauged by the chair.
Yeah.
Councillor, have you ever made a statement in council, on social media, whatever, that this council is corrupt?
No, and in fact, I've always
No,
made it
I think
clear.
it was a binary question.
No, no.
You answered, no. I'm saying, have you ever made a statement to that effect?
I would like to say that I have never said this council is corrupt, but some of its processes are corrupt or dishonest. And the point is, there is corruption financially. I don't believe anyone at this council is financially corrupt. But there are corrupt processes, i.e. you consult and it won't change the outcome. That is a process that is not that is dishonest. And things like a lot of the borough plan stuff, it has been a corrupt process. I've not said corrupt individuals. It's a process that means that when we actually try and respond to a consultation, a lot of the data is wrong or the consultation is meaningless because decisions have already been made.
Could I go
Yes,
back?
please,
Of course
carry on.
you've never said any individual is corrupt, because that would put you in a certain position. But I'm asking you again, you've never said the council is corrupt. And be careful with your answer.
There are some 20,000 tweets I've probably made. I could not remember the exact phraseology of every tweet. I have clearly highlighted how dishonest and how corrupt some of the processes this council has done and how rotten the borough plan is.
I'll give you a bit of advice. Follow Toby Young and see how many you can delete then, before other people find them.
Okay, does anyone else have any comments? Sorry, Councillor Troy.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it says, what's the committee being asked to consider? It says clear and understandable. Having read through it, it appears to be that. Represents best practice. I don't know. I think we needed a legal opinion or some context from the officers saying, you know, it's best practice in our view because because it seems to be that we're just being asked to form that view entirely independently. It's consistent with other policies, well, seems to be, but it talks about under 5.1.3 on page 17 of the pack, page 5 of Appendix A, the threshold being at least £25. But the member training and a whole bunch of other stuff we've talked about has varied between £5 and £10 for people to put stuff down on the sheet. And indeed, when we've looked at what people have disclosed once a year in this committee, there's a whole bunch of stuff down there for £7.50 or the equivalent of a tenner or a fiver. But yet this is now talking about a threshold of at least 25. So that wouldn't seem to be consistent, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe we go with this and just change the other policies to fit with it, and the member training to fit with it. That would be my only comments.
Just in response to that, I understand the Gibson hospitality policy does state £25, and that's the amount that must be disclosed, but we do encourage members to disclose everything.
Especially officers, Chair. It can be less than £25 if an officer has been offered a gift or hospitality. We do ask them to declare it as a matter of transparency.
So why don't we set it at anything?
I suspect because anything that's given as a gift can be considered as in the wrong way.
Yeah.
The answer to that, Chair, is that the Gibson hospitality policy was a agglomeration of two policies. One was the officer code, the other was the members code. The members code set the limit at £25 by law, so it was adopted as part of that. But in doing that, it was always recognised that any gift or offer of hospitality could, if an officer was concerned, be declared. And in particular, we encourage officers to declare offers even where the gift of hospitality is declined, as a matter of openness and transparency.
I think on that point then, Chair, if 5.1.3 could have a couple of lines added to that effect, you know, where it says the register is, you know, however, all officers are encouraged to disclose any amount, you know, whether offered or actually received. And then it's consistent with the other policies, because if you just read this, you would then know as an employee or a member everything about bribery and corruption, yes, rather than having to look into other documents.
Okay. Thank you for that, Councillor Trent. Can you add those few words, please? Yep. Thank you. Any other member wish to comment? Therefore, can we agree the recommendation as printed on page 11? Please, is that agreed? Thank you. Okay, moving on to, find it.
Page 24.
24. Right, this is a report about compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation. I didn't introduce the gentleman previously, but sitting there by Linda is an officer who actually is employed by Rugby Borough Council. Name of Matthew Lees. Welcome, Matthew. What the Borough Council have done is that they have agreed a longer-term agreement with Rugby Council to have a shared data protection officer. And we now have to legally have a data protection officer. I understand that we went to a lot of trouble to try and find the right person, but we felt that what the people that we had didn't fall within what we were requiring. So we then entered into the negotiations with Rugby, and it was agreed that we would share our protection officer, and Matthew is well learned, I understand, in data protection. I won't call him an expert because he said, don't call me that. Well learned in data protection. So I'm actually going to ask Matthew if you want to present this report for us, please.
Thank you, Chair. So You have the report. I won't go through all of it, but I've just picked out a few areas just to highlight and just to draw to your attention. So firstly, and I suppose most importantly, which has driven some of the decisions by here, is that new regulations are coming into effect later this year on the 25th of May. Everything has to be in place by then. So there's a sense of urgency. It's a common thought from people that well, we're leaving the European Union, surely this EU regulation doesn't apply anymore. Actually it does. It comes into law on the 25th of May regardless. The other thing I'd just say about that is that there is currently a data protection bill that's going through the UK Parliament. It's at the Lord's report stage at the moment, which replicates much of this and has some other information as well. So whichever way we look at it, it will apply. Paragraph 4.3 just highlights a part of that data protection bill which doesn't get a huge amount of airtime, but that we do need to be aware of, and that's the Law Enforcement Directive. So any organisation that carries out any criminal investigation or prosecution has to comply with that, and of course things like health and safety breaches and food standards and those kinds of things that are criminal will come under that. So we'll be looking at that as well. Section 5 just gives a very brief overview just to remind you that we already have data protection policies. They will need to be updated. Actually, the data protection policies that you have currently are good policies. They do nevertheless need to be updated to take account of the new regulations. Section 6 highlights what I've called the Article 37 responsibilities, which perhaps highlights that I'm a little bit of a geek on GDPR, and I start talking in articles. I apologise for that. That's the bit that talks about the data protection officer. Every public sector organisation must appoint a data protection officer, and that includes, although I know we don't have any in Nuneaton, that does include town and parish councils. So that's a bit of a challenge for them and how they're going to do that. It's a statutory position. That post holder can't be fired for doing their job. They can be fired for not doing it or doing it badly, but they can't be fired for doing it. So there are some protections around it. But the idea of a role is to provide a bit of an arm's length view and advice to the authority. And there's some regulations in there that describe about conflict of interest to make sure that there are none, basically. And as been mentioned, a group of authorities can together appoint a data protection officer, and that's the route we've gone down. So we've been working in information management and data protection, amongst other things, in rugby over the last 10 years. So it's one of the advantages of working with rugby and yourselves is we have a lot of shared systems and shared processes and indeed shared services. So where we can do the job once and apply it twice, that's what we'll do. Section 6.7 highlights some of the other roles that and what there are within the authority that have a relevance, just to show how it all fits together. Now, 7.2 highlights, again talking in article numbers, the council must maintain this record of processing activity. Now that's something that the council has to do currently under the Data Protection Act, but it looks very different. It's basically how we register with the Information Commissioner, what kinds of information do we hold, and that's what we do. But Article 30 highlights some very specific elements that we have to hold. We have to know all of the personal data we hold, the reason why we hold it, how long we hold it for, what legal basis we have to hold it, what rights each data subject, that's the person whose data we hold, has in relation to that data. And one of the main differences now is that we have to have all of this proof in place before we do it, if you like. So previously we had to comply with this type of responsibility, but now we have to document before we do it. So that's one of the main differences. And then section 7.3, we have to provide privacy notices. There are exceptions to this, but in most cases we have to actually tell the people whose data we hold all of that same information again. What information we hold, why we hold it, what the legal basis is, how long we hold it for, and what the rights are of that data subject processing. Now, there are exemptions to that, but as a matter of course, that's what we have to do. There's lots of detail in here, I won't guide you through, but I did want to highlight paragraph 7.11 because it relates to you personally as councillors. So the organisation as a whole is responsible for complying with the General Data Protection Regulation. All of the staff must comply with those regulations, and if the council shares data with you, you are responsible for all that data as well. Separately to that, if you hold personal data for your own purposes as elected members, you must register with the Information Commissioner. Now, I understand that actually that's done for you on your behalf, essentially. But you will need to be aware of the new responsibilities that you have for that data come the 25th of May. So we'll provide some training for you, but we'll do that in two sections. Once before the 25th of May, we'll have to program it in, probably April, sometime around there. And then after the local election for new members, we'll do another training session as well. The reason why it's very important, highlighted in section 7.14, I haven't put the numbers in, perhaps I should have done, but the potential penalties are actually huge. For every breach of the regulation, there is the potential for a fine of up to 20 million euros.
I think there are a few gasps at that
Yes.
point.
In addition, the regulation gives data subjects a new right to sue for damage and harm caused an offence. So if you can imagine, we accidentally published, or let's not talk about we, because that's just a bit close to home, but an authority elsewhere in the country was to accidentally publish the entire council tax database somewhere, and all of the taxpayers carried out a class action. There'd be a 20 million euro fine, potentially, plus payments to every single individual affected. So it's important we get it right. So leave it at that. There are some uncertainties still remaining about what the exact requirements are going to be. The reason for that is because the regulation as published allows member states to amend certain parts of a regulation. An example for that is the definition of children. If we deal with personal information belonging to children, then there are extra things that we have to do. Now, the regulation defines a child as age 16, under 16, but the UK government have indicated that they are going to lower that to under 30. It's probably not going to have a significant impact on this authority either way, but I highlight that as an example because there are many others of these that can be changed or tweaked. Definitions of what public interest means and what's a significant public interest, those types of things that matter down to the nitty-gritty, but we don't know yet. So just mentioning that in section 8.2, we are going to have to keep that data protection bill under review, and we'll continue to do that. And it may well be that there are some things that we have to amend later on to comply with some of that data. But that's only with you, and welcome any questions again.
Thank you, Matthew. Just to reiterate the one point that was made about 7.11, about producing guidance for members and offering training, and that will be training for every member. to help ourselves. I know officers will receive relevant training as well, but to help us as councillors prepare for the GDPR before it comes into effect, because I doubt any of us would want to overstep the line or the mark in relation to this issue. So we will, when the training is put in, we really will need to reiterate the need for elected members. There will be a session, because the GDPR comes in before May, there will be a session before May, but there will need to be then a further session for any new councillors that may be joining after May. You know, when it comes through, please put it in your diaries because it is vitally important. We are aware of this. Right, any member have any wish to comment on this particular item? Councillor True.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got one question. Obviously, we're sharing a data protection officer. Great. The experience is that there's likely to be a turnover in data protection officers because you guys are quite in demand with all these changes happening. If we're sharing you between two councils, there's twice the propensity of us having to replace you, logically. What's the backup plan? Who steps up? Is there a company or an organisation identified to provide those services short-term while a recruitment process went on? Or have you got a deputy that's already trained and highlighted, or what?
First off, it's probably helpful me to say I don't have to go anywhere, but I take the wider point. But the agreement that we have in place is to provide a shared service arrangement for data protection and information management. So I can provide a little, I say a little bit of expertise, quite modestly, around freedom of information requests, those types of things as well. And I have a small team who can help with that. But it remains the case that a data protection officer has to be an individual officer. Although you can appoint an organisation, that organisation then has to define who it is. So there has to be some flexibility in the enforcement of that to take account of this. And my experience of the Information Commissioner is she's a pragmatic lady. If at a particular point you have the need for a data protection officer and there doesn't happen to be anybody in post, but there is a clear direction of travel to replace that officer, that would be absolutely fine.
Right. I think from a risk planning point of view, it would still be a comfort to the committee and to the councils, both councils, to know that there was a clear plan in place in case that recruitment wasn't likely to happen very quickly. And as I said earlier, data protection officers are in demand. It might not be the easiest thing in the world to hire somebody for many, many months. So, especially local authorities who aren't able to exercise quite the same pay flexibility as a commercial organisation. So I think there'd be some comfort in your team coming up with this is what will happen should the data protection officer no longer be able to perform their duties. This is what we would look to do in the ideal situation. This is what we'd do as the fallback. I think that would be quite reassuring.
There are a number of options that we could consider, because obviously there are a lot of local authorities very close to us. They're going to have to appoint data protection officers, so we could maybe approach another local authority in the short term and come up with an agreement. So we can.
Sounds like a good idea, Linda. I think whatever the answer is, we'd just like to have that worked out beforehand.
And so maybe short-term agreements are always going to be easier to come to than a longer term. And the other thing, perhaps to highlight that, I did suggest in section 8.4 we bring a further report back later, and perhaps we can incorporate some comments around that in the next report.
Thank you.
Any other member wish to comment? Bob?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that's an excellent point. It's been raised about backup because, well, I wish you no illness, but you have no idea who else is in your team, etc., or whatever, or whether you are the team. You are, I don't know. But I think in that sense, it's a good question. One other thing, I'm going to ask maybe a little personal favour of you, if you like, in the sense that I'm one of these people that actually watches the parliamentary channel. and I sit and watch the House of Commons, etc., yeah, and I do like debates there. My wife thinks I'm crazy, and actually she's right. But in it talks in here about it, you know, where it is in the process. I would be interested as to when, I don't like watching the House of Lords for some reason, but the House of Commons, when this bill comes through, if you have, I mean, there might be other silly people in this room as well, I'm sure there are, but I would like the information of when that's in the Commons. Because sometimes I miss something that I've been waiting on.
So I can tell you that it's back in the Lords on the 17th, which is
Tomorrow? Oh, okay.
so there you go. I believe it's due in the Commons in March, but there's a link on the parliamentary website that details all of it.
Yeah.
So perhaps I can circulate that to you.
Okay, thank you.
Any
Chair.
other?
Chair, for the qualification, I think it is brought out, I think slightly in paragraph 7.6, because I think Simone was like, I have another life as a pension trustee, so we're looking at GDPR through that, but I think actually understanding where you've got service providers as well is going to be quite key, and I know you're doing the information audit, but understanding which information you put with service providers is going to be quite key as well, whether knowingly or unknowingly. I mean, as a firm, I mean, just to let you know that we will be updating a letter has been going in from May to confirm that we do comply with GDPR. So that'll be picked up as part of next year's audit. So we're already going through that process. You know, because clearly as your auditors, we at times will have access to information, but we have also a responsibility to ensure whilst our files have to be followed, we only keep the minimum data on there. So if we do have someone's HR number, we have the HR number on there, but not the name, not the address, if you know what I mean, so someone can re-perform the test. So we're quite aware of the issues around that. But I think understanding where your service providers are, you know, because I said it's not for yourselves per se, but you've had a leisure trust and they've got all information on members, it flows through you, and I think you've got that issue there around what do you put it into contracts. But I would expect I'd be looking for my service provider to be a bit more proactive actually as well around this, because they know it's coming as well. So it's just really just think it's not just you, it's actually who you actually deal with as well.
Any other member wish to comment? So therefore we have the recommendation within there which talks about the Article 37 appointment of the Data Protection Officer be noted, the progress towards compliance be noted, and a further report on compliance to be brought to Audit and Standards Committee in due course. Is that recommendation agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to agenda item 9. Any other items? I have not been alerted to any other items. No, we have no other items we have been alerted to. Agenda item 10. Exclusion of the public and the press. I understand, Councillor Conley, that you wish to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I think this should actually be held in public. There is nothing in these papers that is about anyone other than me, and therefore I would request that this next item is held in public. All the information within it is either in the public domain or can be in the public domain because it's about me, and if you read the pink papers, no other name of any complainant or anything is mentioned in the pink papers. So I request for transparency that we actually hold the next part in public so that the public can see what you're going to do about these 4 complaints and the whole fiasco and how it's unfolding. Thank you.
It is entirely the decision of this committee whether or not the following item, which has been presented to us on confidential papers, but it is entirely the decision of this committee as to whether or not these papers are considered in public or otherwise. Does anyone?
Chair, there are other names mentioned in the report.
There are other names mentioned in the report, yes, other than Councillor Condical. So what is the wishes of the committee in relation to this issue?
I feel that we have to respect the privacy of the other people mentioned.
So you are recommending we move into private session. Is there a seconder for that proposal?
I'll second it.
Thank you. So it has been proposed and seconded that this item is held in private session. So if there is anyone who shouldn't be here, could you please leave
You
if
need
you
to take a
wish.
vote, Chair.
Yeah, sorry, I do need to take a vote. All those in favour of it being held in private, please show. Anyone against?
That's been moved,
Abstentions, thank you.
that's carried, Chair.
So that is carried. So the item will be held and the recording will not be recorded.